Happening right now, the McLean County School Board is hearing the final proposal on the future of 2 elementary schools, but nearly 24 parents are making their voices heard first. The public comment portion of the meeting is still in progress, but we can bring you some details. Consultants will present once public comment is over. Many community members present tonight are against the closure of Carlock Elementary, as well as the repurposing of Glen Elementary from a school to a transitional services for 18 to 22-year-olds. Those parents are hoping to hear a recommended proposal that would keep Carlock open and keep Glen as an elementary school.
I think Glen Elementary is a pillar within the community. I think the reasons for which we've been presented with closing Glen Elementary are completely dismissive of the outcomes that Glen has provided to the community and to the students.
Several people expressed fears that the open enrollment part of the proposal that would keep Carlock and Glen as they are would disadvantage low-income and minority students. An online meeting with more information on these proposals is scheduled for tomorrow at 6 o'clock. The board is expected to vote on a final decision at next month's meeting.